Black woman faces court battle against cop, but she shocks everyone with her U.S. elite status. Nia Parker was just another face in the crowd, or so everyone thought. One sweltering afternoon in the heart of Atlanta, she found herself in a confrontation with a local cop that would change both of their lives forever. The whispers spread quickly. A black woman standing up against a law enforcement officer in a high-stakes court battle. That alone was sensational. But beneath the surface, an even bigger secret lay coiled, ready to strike. Nia's credentials weren't just impressive, they were elite. And as she stepped into the harsh glare of the public eye, no one was prepared for the shockwaves that would follow. Nia Parker's early life had never been easy, but she learned to face adversity head-on, a trait instilled in her by her parents. Her father, Malcolm Parker, was a schoolteacher who'd grown up near Selma, Alabama. He used to tell her stories of the famed Bloody Sunday March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He explained how, despite tear gas and billy clubs, black men and women stood their ground for the right to vote. Her mother, Yvonne Parker, served as a nurse in the very hospital where Nia was born in Atlanta. They believed in the power of education and perseverance. They urged her to aim high, so high that the glass ceiling they had faced would shatter into a million pieces. Nia grew up just a few miles from the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. As a child, she wandered through the exhibits at the museum, enthralled by the stories of civil rights legends who had literally changed the law of the land. Every day, she passed the King Center on her way to school and felt the echoes of that enduring fight for justice stir within her. Her parents often reminded her that she was a product of their sacrifices, and she wanted to carry that legacy forward. Through sheer determination and an uncanny intelligence, Nia excelled in all her classes. She graduated top of her high school class at the age of 17, which paved the way for acceptance letters from prestigious universities all over the country. Many of her classmates envied her. But for Nia, each acceptance letter was not just a personal triumph. It was a step forward for the entire Parker family. And so, when she chose to attend Harvard University, a real name that carried enormous weight, she did so not just for herself, but for the dreams of her parents and her entire community. She accepted a generous financial aid package and left Atlanta for Cambridge, Massachusetts, brimming with hope and determination. At Harvard, Nia felt for the first time the stark contrast between privilege and poverty, between those who had generational wealth and those who fought tooth and nail to rise above. She spent countless late nights in the libraries, devouring textbooks on political theory, civil rights, and constitutional law. Graduating summa cum laude, Nia went on to earn a spot at Harvard Law School, an achievement that once felt like a distant fantasy. But Nia's ambitions stretched beyond the walls of academia. She wanted hands-on experience in making the world a better place. During her summers, she interned at the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, advocating for prison reform and tackling unjust sentencing policies that disproportionately affected minority communities. She volunteered with local organizations like the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, returning to her home city to do pro bono work for those who couldn't afford an attorney. With each case she assisted on, her passion for justice only grew stronger, fueling her dedication to stand up for the underrepresented. By her mid-20s, she had already caught the eye of high-profile legal firms in Washington, D.C. and New York. But Nia turned them down. She decided she wanted to serve in the U.S. Army JAG Corps, a surprising move to many who knew her. She felt duty-bound to protect the constitutional rights of soldiers, many of whom came from the same marginalized communities she cared about. The rigors of basic training at Fort Benning in Georgia tested her in ways books at Harvard couldn't prepare her for. Yet she thrived, forging a steely resilience both physically and mentally. She steadily rose in rank, earning the respect of her peers and commanding officers alike. Eventually, Nia's sharp mind, unwavering ethics, and relentless dedication earned her a coveted position in a specialized unit that handled top-secret legal matters. Her name appeared on case files that were stamped classified, and her colleagues in the Pentagon started to recognize her as a rising star. Her parents swelled with pride, and her mother often bragged about how her daughter was protecting the country from the inside. After fulfilling her service, Nia could have walked into virtually any elite law firm in the country. Instead, she decided to return to Atlanta, where she believed the fight for justice was still intense and personal. She hoped to open her own small practice, focusing on civil rights cases, and perhaps eventually run for a local judgeship. But fate had other plans for her. A single fateful encounter on a hot summer afternoon would catapult her into the headlines. In the blink of an eye, her entire life's work, her training, education, and moral compass would be called into question. Little did anyone know that the person who questioned her would be Officer Brent Marshall, a local cop with a reputation for being harsh toward the city's black residents. When these two met, it would be more than just a local controversy. It would be a collision of principles, an intersection of race, power, and the secret cards Nia held close to her chest. Because Officer Marshall, and indeed most of the world, had no idea who Nia truly was, or what she was capable of. The unforgiving sun hung high over an Atlanta side street as Nia stepped out of her car. She had pulled into a small grocery store parking lot near the historic Auburn Avenue district, her arms loaded with an assortment of legal files and groceries. With temperatures hovering near the mid-90s, the asphalt shimmered with heat. She balanced 2 grocery bags while rummaging in her purse for her car keys. That's when she noticed the piercing gaze of Officer Brent Marshall. He was sitting inside his patrol car, the engine running, air conditioning likely on full blast. His eyes were fixed on her in a way that set off alarm bells in Nia's mind. She'd seen that look before. She recalled how her father was once pulled over on a whim, simply for driving an older model car in a nice neighborhood. The tension in the air was palpable, and a sense of dread knotted itself in her stomach. Marshall stepped out of his patrol car and approached. His crisp uniform bore the Atlanta Police Department badge, and his walk was marked by a swagger that suggested confidence or arrogance. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" he asked, leaning a bit too close, his hand resting on the butt of his gun as if out of habit rather than necessity. Nia, knowing her rights, responded politely. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" "Identification," he demanded, his tone clipped and cool. Nia let out a slow breath, carefully placing her groceries on the ground. She reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license, handing it to him. She could feel the intensity of his stare, searching her for any sign of guilt or defiance. "Mind telling me why you're asking?" she inquired calmly, determined not to let him intimidate her. Her question only seemed to irritate him further. "Look, we've had some incidents of shoplifting around here, and you look suspicious." He gave her a once-over as if he was assessing a threat level. Nia's eyebrows shot up. She was wearing a professional blouse and tailored pants, hardly the attire of a petty shoplifter. The store manager, a middle-aged woman named Caroline, popped her head out. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked, her tone polite but concerned. She recognized Nia as a frequent customer. "There's no need for you to worry," Officer Marshall answered curtly, waving Caroline away. He looked back down at Nia's license, his lips tightening. "You sure you're not carrying any stolen items?" he asked, nodding toward the grocery bags. Taken aback, Nia placed a hand on her hip. "Everything in that bag has a receipt," she replied, her voice firm. She kept her cool, but the tension in her eyes gave away her frustration. She was intimately familiar with racial profiling cases through her work at the ACLU during her law school internships. Now she was experiencing it firsthand, and it felt more humiliating and infuriating than any legal brief could have captured. Officer Marshall insisted on checking her bags. Nia hesitated for a moment. She knew her rights, but she also sensed that refusing could escalate the situation. Reluctantly, she handed over the bags, each containing nothing more sinister than bread, fruit, and yogurt. Marshall rifled through them, coming up empty. As she looked on, Nia bit her lip, trying to calm the flurry of thoughts in her head. She thought about her father's advice. Always remain calm, Never give them a reason to say you resisted. She also remembered the stories her mother told of patients who were hospitalized after lesser altercations with the police. She steadied her breathing. Seemingly unsatisfied, Marshall turned his attention to the folder of legal documents resting on her passenger seat, visible through the open car door. "What's all that?" he asked. His tone betrayed a mix of suspicion and curiosity. In that folder were case notes for a veteran's benefits dispute she was consulting on. Some of it was sensitive but not classified. Still, it was none of his business. "That's my work," she answered, clipping each word. "I'm an attorney, Officer Marshall. Now, if there's nothing else, I'd like my license back." She held out her hand expectantly. He hesitated, eyes flicking from her license to her face and then to her waiting hand. In that small space of hesitation, a decision was made. Instead of returning her license, he slid it into his pocket. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the station," he declared. Naya's heart kicked into overdrive. "On what grounds?" Her voice rose, echoing in the parking lot. Caroline stepped closer, but a warning glare from Marshall told her to stay back. The grocery store manager looked torn, obviously wanting to intervene but unwilling to confront a uniformed cop in public. "You refuse to cooperate, and I suspect there might be more to this situation," Marshall responded. His words were as vague as they were menacing. Naya's nostrils flared. She knew the law. She knew he had zero probable cause to detain her. "I'm not resisting, but I am not willingly going with you," she said firmly. She prayed that passers-by in the parking lot could see what was happening. Maybe someone was filming. In the modern age, everything could change if a smartphone camera captured this exchange. Marshall reached for his handcuffs, swiftly snapping them around Nia's wrists before she could protest further. The metal bit into her skin, sending a jolt of panic through her veins. She glanced around, eyes wide, realizing that everything she'd ever studied about civil liberties was unraveling right before her. Her frustration turned into a fiery resolve. She would not be another statistic, another quiet victim of racial profiling who cowered in shame. She was going to fight. "Officer Marshall," she said through gritted teeth, "you're making a mistake." Her voice wavered slightly with anger and a tinge of disbelief. He simply smirked, tightening the cuffs a notch more than necessary. As he led her to the patrol car, bystanders gathered. Some looked horrified, others fumbled with their phones to record. Caroline stepped forward, her face etched with worry. She tried to ask Marshall what was happening, but he pushed her away gently with his arm, muttering about obstructing police work. Naya's heart pounded. This was not how she envisioned her homecoming to Atlanta. All that training, all those hours in lecture halls and the top-secret cases she had pored over, none of it mattered in that moment. She was just a black woman in cuffs being paraded to a patrol car. The anger inside her glowed like a hot coal, fueling the determination in her soul. As the door slammed shut behind her, she vowed that come what may, she would not rest until justice was served. Darkness and stale air greeted Nia as she was ushered into a holding cell at the nearest precinct. The walls were a dull gray, and a single fluorescent light hummed above her. The room was empty except for a metal bench bolted to the concrete floor. Her wrists still stung from the tight handcuffs, and the humiliation of being paraded inside was thick in her mind. She tried to stay calm, to remember her legal training and that she could call counsel. But the exasperation she felt was almost overpowering. She rubbed at her wrists, taking in deep, measured breaths. Despite the tension, she was somewhat relieved that her phone had been left in her purse at the station's booking desk, safely out of immediate reach of prying police eyes. Time seemed to crawl as she waited for any word on why she was being held. She had demanded a phone call, demanded to know the charges, but her requests had been met with patronizing smiles or outright indifference. Just then the heavy metal door groaned open, and Officer Marshall appeared again, arms folded across his chest. "You want to explain who you really are?" he sneered, stepping into the cell. "An attorney, huh? That's convenient." Nia's pulse quickened. The anger she felt was barely contained. Yes, I'm an attorney and you have no grounds to keep me here. I demand to see a lawyer, or to be released immediately. Don't get ahead of yourself, he replied, exuding an unearned confidence. We're checking if your license is valid. Could be fake for all I know. Nia tried to keep her voice steady, but she couldn't hide the annoyance. Are you hearing yourself? Do you realize how insane that sounds? He took a step forward, close enough that Nia could see the faint lines of tension around his eyes. Around here, he hissed. We don't take any chances, and I don't like your attitude. For a moment, Nia's thoughts flashed to her parents. She pictured her father's kind eyes, her mother's reassuring smile. She imagined telling them she was locked up without cause. The anger in her chest blossomed. She stared at Marshall, refusing to flinch. Without warning, the door burst open again, and another officer, a tall woman with short-cropped hair and an air of authority, stepped inside. Her badge read Lieutenant Angela Roberts. She shot Marshall a disapproving glance and addressed Nia directly. Miss Parker, is it? She asked, her voice neutral yet authoritative. That's right, Nia replied, turning from Marshall to Roberts. She recognized the shift in atmosphere the moment the lieutenant walked in. This was someone higher in the chain of command, someone who might actually follow procedure. Lieutenant Roberts sighed. I've been apprised of this situation. We ran your license, you check out. Indeed, you're an attorney. We also found some interesting notations on your record. Army JAG, if I'm not mistaken. Nia's eyebrows arched in surprise. She wasn't aware that the station would have access to any detailed references to her military background, especially her work in specialized units. But apparently, some marker existed in the system. Maybe it was a simple reference to her service or her high-level clearance. In any case, it was enough to make Roberts tread more carefully. Lieutenant Roberts shot him a glare. Marshall, you can leave now. She waited until he retreated, then turned her attention fully back to Nia. I apologize for any inconvenience or misunderstanding, but I need to hear your side of the story. Nia took a moment to gather herself. She was determined, but also wary. Officer Marshall saw me at a grocery store, decided I looked suspicious and demanded to search my bags. I complied even though he had no probable cause. He then took my license and arrested me without explaining any charges. The lieutenant nodded slowly, as if she'd heard such stories before. Marshall claims you were resisting. That's a typical charge he's used before, though we're still investigating whether it's justified this time. Nia cut her off. I never resisted. There are witnesses. One of them is the store manager. She can confirm everything. Lieutenant Roberts pursed her lips. Yes, we've got her statement. It doesn't line up with Marshall's version. To be frank, Miss Parker, you'll likely be released soon. However, this has become a departmental matter, and there will be an investigation. An investigation? Nia repeated, her tone both hopeful and incredulous. She hadn't expected such a quick step toward accountability. Typically, these cases dragged on, and the victim often ended up burying themselves in legal fees to get any semblance of justice. Roberts nodded. Yes. However, while that internal investigation runs its course, you'll need to appear in court because of the resisting arrest charge Marshall put on you. They're filing the paperwork now. Nia felt a wave of frustration. But that's groundless. I wasn't resisting. This is insane. The lieutenant held up a hand, a gesture to calm her. I understand. We'll get to the bottom of it. For now, you'll be taken to a local judge who'll set bail, or possibly dismiss the charge if the evidence is insufficient. With that, the lieutenant escorted Nia out of the cell and through the labyrinthine corridors of the station, eventually depositing her in a waiting area. She was no longer in cuffs, but her sense of freedom felt uneasy. The lingering glances from other officers, the hustle of people in uniform, and the smell of disinfectant made her skin crawl. At last, Nia was allowed a phone call. She retrieved her cell from the desk and immediately dialed the number of an old friend from Harvard Law, Melissa Anderson, who now worked at a prominent civil rights firm in Atlanta. The phone rang, and after a brief pause, Melissa's reassuring voice cut through. Nia, everything okay? Not exactly, Nia admitted. I need representation immediately. Within an hour, Melissa stormed into the station, heels clicking decisively on the linoleum floor. Her aura of confidence filled the precinct. She demanded to speak with the supervising officer, made it clear that Nia had been unlawfully detained, and threatened to unleash a legal firestorm if the situation wasn't resolved. For the moment, Lieutenant Roberts agreed to release Nia on her own recognizance until the court hearing the next day. Stepping out into the muggy Atlanta air again, Nia felt like she was awakening from a nightmare. Yet in the pit of her stomach, a different sensation brewed, something akin to determination. If they thought she would cower or quietly slip away, they were wrong. She intended to go to court, show the world what really happened, and hold Officer Marshall accountable not just for her, but for anyone else who had been subjected to similar treatment. Still, a nagging question loomed in her mind. Would her military background and elite credentials come to light in a way that overshadowed the real issue? Or worse, would they complicate the case and give the opposition more ammunition to paint her as some sort of militant or potential threat? She'd have to be strategic, she realized. Even though part of her wanted to stand at a podium and shout her story to the world, she knew the judicial process required precision, patience, and airtight evidence. As she sank into the passenger seat of Melissa's car, Nia could only imagine the media frenzy that was about to ensue. The last thing she wanted was attention for attention's sake. But maybe, in the swirl of public scrutiny, some measure of truth and justice would finally find their way to the surface. Early morning light filtered through tall windows as Nia and Melissa made their way into the Fulton County Courthouse. The building was a testament to bureaucracy, with marble floors, metal detectors, and lines of people milling about, some glancing nervously at thick sheaves of legal papers in their hands. This was the place where fates could change in an instant. Melissa escorted Nia through the security checkpoint, and they headed straight to courtroom 2B, where Judge Diana Harkness presided. Word had spread quickly about Nia Parker's arrest, possibly because the store manager's bystanders posted videos on social media. The clip of a black woman being handcuffed by a white police officer with no apparent reason had gone viral overnight. Several local news stations had picked up the story, adding to the sense that the morning's arraignment would be anything but ordinary. Inside the courtroom, a sea of faces blurred into murmured chatter. Local reporters sat along one side, their cameras discreetly set up to capture any significant moment. Friends and community activists, some with Black Lives Matter t-shirts, had come to offer support. Nia noticed her parents in the back row, her mother's eyes red with concern, her father's jaw set in anger. She forced a small, reassuring smile, though her own heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Across the aisle, Officer Brent Marshall sat at a table with the city prosecutor, a lean man with dark-rimmed glasses named Christopher Hatch. Hatch appeared calm, as though this were a routine case. Marshall, on the other hand, looked stiff and unsettled, eyes darting around the room as if worried about public opinion. Nia locked eyes with him for a moment, and the tension in the air was almost tangible. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Harkness entered. She was a seasoned judge known for her fair but strict rulings. The entire room quieted as she took her seat, adjusting her glasses before scanning the docket. "Case number 2025 to 1982, State of Georgia versus Nia Parker," intoned the court clerk. "Charge, resisting arrest and obstruction of justice." Judge Harkness's gaze shifted to Nia. "Miss Parker, how do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Nia responded, voice steady, though her nerves were taut as wires. Melissa placed a reassuring hand on Nia's shoulder. The prosecutor, Hatch, stood. "Your Honor, the arresting officer had reason to believe Miss Parker was engaged in suspicious activity. When approached, the defendant allegedly refused to cooperate, becoming verbally combative. The officer had no choice but to restrain her for his own safety." A small chorus of gasps and mutters rippled through the crowd behind Nia. She had to bite her lip to keep from shouting her objections right then. Melissa raised her hand. "Your Honor, we have witness statements and video evidence that directly contradict Officer Marshall's account. We'll be presenting them at the earliest opportunity." Judge Harkness leaned forward, tapping her pen against a stack of papers. Miss Parker has no prior record, correct? Hatch glanced at his notes. None, Your Honor. The judge looked at Melissa. What do you propose? Melissa explained calmly. We request that all charges be dropped immediately, Your Honor. The evidence we have shows that Miss Parker complied with every request and was arrested without probable cause. Judge Harkness sighed, weighing the matter. I'm not dismissing the charge yet, but I will set a hearing for the presentation of evidence. For now, Miss Parker is released on her own recognizance. Court is adjourned. The gavel banged, setting off a flurry of movement. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashed, and questions were thrown around the courtroom like confetti. Nia kept her head high, but she felt her stomach churn. She spotted her parents making their way through the throng, their expressions a mix of relief and anger. This is a travesty, her father snapped. We taught you to stand up for yourself, and now look at this. I'm proud of you, but furious at them. Nia's mother pressed a hand to her cheek. Baby, are you all right? Nia nodded, forcing a smile. I'm okay, Mom, we're going to fight this. Just then, a reporter with a local TV microphone shoved forward. Miss Parker, can you tell us about the rumors that you were part of a specialized military legal team? What classified cases did you handle? Nia felt her heart jolt. She shouldn't be surprised that someone dug into her background, but she bristled at the question. Before she could respond, Melissa intervened, expertly brushing the reporter aside. No comment right now, thank you. Outside the courthouse, a small group of protesters held signs that read, Stop Racial Profiling and Justice for Nia. Some recognized her and offered words of support. She felt tears prick her eyes at their kindness, even as a swirl of anxiety churned in her gut. She realized that a tidal wave of scrutiny was heading her way, one that could dredge up her entire past, including details of her service she'd tried to keep discreet. Melissa steered her away from the cameras, guiding her to the edge of the courthouse steps. We need to talk. The next hearing could be crucial, she said, keeping her voice low. I want to line up every piece of evidence we have, the store manager's statement, any cell phone footage. But Nia, there's something else. The prosecutor has subpoenaed your military records. Nia's breath caught in her throat. He's subpoenaed them? But most of my service details are classified. They can't just rummage through that. Melissa nodded. I know, and there's a possibility that if they find anything remotely relevant, they'll try to spin it to question your character, like if you had any altercations, or if you ever used your combat training in a violent way. We know that's not who you are, but they'll try anything. Nia clenched her fists, anger and worry swirling within her. I just want to make sure the real issue here, racial profiling, is not overshadowed by some twisted narrative about my military background. Melissa sighed. I understand, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that your elite status could come out in the open. The prosecutor might even claim you used your training to intimidate Officer Marshall. Nia laughed bitterly. Intimidate him? He arrested me, not the other way around. That's how they play the game, Melissa responded grim. They'll do anything to protect Marshall from charges of wrongdoing. For a moment, Nia let her guard down, exhaustion etched into her face. Her mind raced back to the hours she spent at Fort Benning. She remembered the drill sergeant's commands, the constant physical training, and learning about the uniform code of military justice. She never envisioned using that knowledge for her own defense in a civilian court. Yet here she was, with everything on the line. A distant rumble of thunder signaled an approaching storm, a fitting backdrop for the turmoil of her life right now. She looked up at the darkening sky. Let them bring it on, she whispered, more to herself than to Melissa. I've come too far to back down. They parted ways with her parents shortly after, promising to keep in close contact. Nia agreed to go on a local radio show to share her side of the story, an idea Melissa supported as a strategic way to garner public sympathy. But inside, Nia knew she had to walk a fine line. Public support was crucial, yet she had to avoid revealing sensitive details about her service. As the courthouse emptied, Nia realized the battle had only just begun. The next few days would test not only her resolve, but also her willingness to delve back into a life she'd tried to keep private. She had once been lauded as a hero in certain corridors of power. Now she was being painted as a potential menace. If she failed to stand her ground, everything she believed in, justice, equality, the very principles she fought to uphold, would be tarnished. And if she succeeded, perhaps she could set a precedent that would help others who found themselves wronged by those meant to protect them. Naya squared her shoulders, stepping down the courthouse stairs. Outside, the first droplets of rain kissed her skin. She offered a silent promise to herself. No matter how fierce the storm, I will weather it. The days after the arraignment slid by in a blur of legal paperwork, strategizing sessions with Melissa, and countless phone calls from concerned friends, family, and curious reporters. Nia felt torn between wanting to present her case to the world and needing to preserve aspects of her military service that were not meant for public consumption. It wasn't long before the media pounced on her background. Local outlets unearthed that she had served in the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General Corps, but they only hinted at more specialized assignments. A few murmurs on social media claimed she'd handled top-secret matters, but no one outside of the loop had solid proof. "You can't run from this," Melissa told her one afternoon in Nia's apartment. Stacks of legal documents and half-eaten takeout cartons covered the coffee table. "You need to decide how much to reveal. If the prosecutor tries to smear you as some militant vigilante, you need a counter-strategy." Nia exhaled, leaning back against her couch. "Part of me wants to just come clean. Tell the judge that I served my country in a specialized unit, that I handled significant legal cases involving national security. But I can't say more without crossing into classified territory." Melissa nodded. "We'll do what we must to protect your rights and your privacy. But if we need to use your service record as evidence of your character, evidence that you deeply respect the law, then so be it." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Nia rose to answer, finding a courier holding a large envelope. She signed for it, heart thumping as she spotted the return address, City Prosecutor's Office. She tore open the seal, scanning the contents. It was a formal notice that they had obtained some portion of her Army records and intended to introduce them at the upcoming evidentiary hearing. The enclosed copy detailed her promotions, commendations, and basic service timeline. However, large sections were blacked out, presumably for security reasons. Melissa skimmed the pages, eyebrows arching. "They're focusing on the fact that you received specialized combat training. And look at this." She pointed to a paragraph referencing an incident in Afghanistan where Nia had provided immediate legal counsel regarding detainee rights. "They're going to insinuate that you're well-versed in handling high-stress confrontations and might have had the upper hand during your arrest." Nia's blood boiled. "So they want to portray me as dangerously competent, as if knowing the law and how to defend myself is a crime?" Melissa set the papers down, a look of disgust crossing her features. "That's exactly what they're doing, but it can backfire on them. We'll show that you've served your country honorably and respect due process. Meanwhile, Marshall's record is about to get dissected too." Nia perked up. "What do we know about him?" Melissa's lips curled into a thin smile. "He's had multiple complaints lodged against him for excessive force and questionable stops, particularly of African-American men. Most were brushed under the rug by his superiors, but we've located a few people willing to testify." A sudden wave of both relief and sorrow washed over Nia. Relief that she might not be alone in exposing Marshall, and sorrow that so many had endured a similar fate. "Then let's bring them forward." They spent the rest of the afternoon building a case plan. They would argue the stop was racially motivated, that the arrest was unlawful, and that Marshall had a pattern of targeting minorities. The introduction of Nia's military background could be used to demonstrate her discipline and respect for authority, flipping the prosecutor's angle on its head. When the day of the evidentiary hearing arrived, the courtroom was once again packed. Reporters seemed to multiply, and local activists turned out in force. Nia's parents were there, along with members of the community she had once assisted pro bono. The tension was electric. Prosecutor Hatch went first, methodically outlining the case against Nia. He displayed some of her military file on an overhead projector, which had entire paragraphs blacked out. Miss Parker served in sensitive capacities, he intoned. During her arrest, she could have easily overpowered Officer Marshall with her advanced training. That raises the question, did she resist with knowledge far beyond that of an average civilian? A scoff rippled through the audience. Melissa rose, smoothing her jacket. Speculation, Your Honor, she said icily. Miss Parker could have overpowered the officer but did not. The law does not charge people for what they could have done, but for what they actually did. And we have video footage showing Miss Parker peacefully complying until Officer Marshall unreasonably escalated the situation. Judge Harkness gestured for the bailiff. The lights dimmed and a large screen displayed the cell phone video taken by a bystander at the grocery store. The audio was somewhat muddled, but it clearly showed Nia placing her groceries on the ground, handing them over for inspection, and calmly talking to Marshall. At no point did she make any threatening moves. Then, on the screen, the officer abruptly cuffed her and shoved her into the patrol car. A hush fell over the courtroom. The footage was damning. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, and Marshall avoided looking at the screen altogether. When the lights came back on, Melissa spoke firmly. This is the real story. A woman going about her day subjected to suspicion and then forcibly arrested without justification. Officer Marshall's claim that Miss Parker resisted is nowhere to be seen in the actual footage. Hatch straightened his tie. We acknowledge the video, but the footage doesn't capture the entire encounter. It doesn't show what happened before or after. The officer claims Miss Parker became verbally aggressive and resisted him placing her in handcuffs. Melissa smiled sweetly. Funny you should mention that. The store manager, Miss Caroline Smith, is here to testify and can attest to what occurred before and after the footage. She beckoned, and Caroline stepped forward, looking nervous but resolute. Under oath, Caroline recounted the events exactly as Nia had described them. She was polite, let him check her bags, the manager said. Officer Marshall just wouldn't let it go. There was no aggression from Miss Parker, none. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Then came the final blow. Melissa introduced two previous complaint filers against Marshall. One man, a local high school teacher, described a harrowing roadside stop that ended with him face down on the pavement for no discernible reason. Another, a grandmother returning from church, spoke of how Marshall had pulled her over for a broken tail light that wasn't actually broken. The tension in the room built to a crescendo. Each testimony chipped away at the image of a law-abiding cop forced to defend himself. Instead, a pattern emerged. A pattern of targeting black individuals with no legitimate cause. Judge Harkness finally called for a recess, her expression severe. After what felt like an eternity, everyone was summoned back. She looked directly at the prosecutor. Mr. Hatch, given the video evidence, witness statements, and Officer Marshall's record of similar complaints, I am inclined to dismiss the charges against Miss Parker. Furthermore, I see sufficient cause to recommend an internal investigation into Officer Marshall's conduct. The crowd erupted in a mix of applause and sighs of relief. Nia felt tears prick her eyes as she glanced at Melissa, who gave a triumphant nod. The judge banged her gavel for order. Court is adjourned, she declared. Miss Parker, you're free to go. Nia wanted to cheer, but she kept her composure. Even though her immediate legal battle was over, she sensed the conflict was far from finished. Outside, cameras flashed and microphones were thrust into her face. This time, though, her words carried a note of victory. I want to thank the judge for upholding justice, and I want to say to everyone out there, you don't have to be powerless when confronted with injustice. Use your voice. Use the law. Behind her, she glimpsed Officer Marshall slinking away, jaw tight, eyes filled with anger and humiliation. The swirl of relief and vindication she felt was potent, but she knew something else lingered in the air. Karma was coming, and it would be swift and final for those who had abused their power for far too long. With the court's dismissal of charges, Nia found herself the unexpected face of a social movement in Atlanta. Calls and emails poured in from strangers who had seen her story on the news. Some were congratulatory. Others had their own tales of racial profiling and police misconduct. It felt like a dam had broken, releasing a surge of pent-up frustration and cries for reform. Nia soon discovered that the city's Internal Affairs Department had launched a formal investigation into Officer Brent Marshall. The local paper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, ran a feature piece on the rising number of complaints against him. A particularly damning editorial questioned why he had been allowed to remain on the force despite repeated red flags. Community activists organized a rally outside the police station, demanding accountability not just for Marshall, but for any officers who shared his mindset. Meanwhile, Nia wrestled with her own newfound notoriety. She hadn't asked to become a public figure, but she couldn't ignore the flood of pleas for help. Melissa gently nudged her. "You have a platform now, Nia. Maybe it's time to consider stepping forward as a leader." She pondered the suggestion. A leadership role would mean more exposure, more scrutiny, and more time away from the quiet life she'd envisioned. A life practicing law in a small firm, maybe starting a family someday. Yet her heart told her she might not get a better opportunity to make a profound difference. One evening she found herself sitting in front of a computer drafting a statement. She typed, deleted, and retyped, struggling to find the right words. Finally, she settled on a measured approach. "I was profiled and arrested without cause. Many have had it worse. We must address the roots of this injustice, not just punish one officer. I encourage the community, the police department, and city leaders to come together, implement training programs, and build trust." She posted the message on social media, expecting modest attention. Instead, it went viral within hours, shared by activists, celebrities, and politicians. Her inbox was flooded with invitations to speak at forums, city council meetings, and even national news programs. The next morning, she woke to discover her name trending on Twitter under the hashtag #StandWithNia. The overwhelming response made her stomach flip. She sensed that her life was irrevocably changing. Her phone buzzed with a call from a Washington, D.C. number she didn't recognize. Tentatively, she answered. "Hello, Miss Parker," a voice spoke. "This is John Klein from the U.S. Department of Justice. We'd like to discuss the possibility of your involvement in a new task force on police reform." Nia almost dropped the phone. In a daze, she agreed to schedule a meeting. After hanging up, she collapsed onto her couch, staring at the ceiling. She had left public service after her army stint, longing for a quieter life. Now it seemed public service was calling her back in a major way. In the midst of all this, news broke that Officer Marshall was suspended pending the outcome of the Internal Affairs investigation. The city's police chief released a statement promising a thorough review of department policies, vowing to crack down on officers who tarnish the badge. For many, it was a sign of progress. For Marshall, it spelled the end of his free reign. The final blow came when Marshall's ex-partner on the force, Officer Jeremy Tolliver, stepped forward with evidence of falsified police reports. In a sworn affidavit, Tolliver detailed how Marshall had doctored details to justify questionable stops. Apparently, Marshall had gone as far as forging signatures to support his claims of probable cause. The revelation hit the department like a thunderbolt. With the public already enraged, calls for Marshall's termination mounted. The media, once politely skeptical, now turned openly hostile toward him. Even the police union, which traditionally defended its members, seemed reluctant to back him. Sources indicated the union's leadership believed Marshall was no longer defensible, especially after the forging allegations emerged. When the internal affairs findings were finally made public, they concluded that Marshall had repeatedly violated department policy, used excessive force in some incidents, and engaged in racial profiling. Within days, the city announced Marshall was fired from the Atlanta Police Department. Some speculated he might face criminal charges for falsifying documents. While many in the community celebrated, Nia felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. She was relieved that at least one problematic officer was being held to account, but she knew firing Marshall wasn't a magic wand that would fix systemic problems. And while she harbored no personal sympathy for the man who had wronged her, she couldn't help but reflect on how a poisonous mindset could grow within a system. She wanted deeper reform, not just one scapegoat to bear the blame. As time passed, her own legal career took a surprising turn. Donations and grants poured into the small civil rights center she had once volunteered at, enabling it to expand. With Melissa's encouragement, she decided to join their ranks, dedicating herself full-time to fighting injustices in the system. The center's board voted unanimously to name her Director of Legal Advocacy, a position she accepted with a trembling mixture of pride and trepidation. One afternoon, she packed up her modest private office to move into her new role, carefully placing her diplomas, Harvard Law, Army JAG, into a box. She paused over a small plaque that read, "Service Before Self." It had been a gift from her former commanding officer at Fort Benning. She ran a finger over the words, recalling the rigors of training and the pride she felt donning the uniform. She thought about how that uniform represented an oath to protect the Constitution, to uphold justice. Now she was just wearing a different uniform, a civilian suit, but the mission remained the same. While she was taping up the boxes, her phone buzzed again. The meeting with the Department of Justice was set for next week. She glanced out the window at the city skyline, the Georgia sun turning the sky into a blaze of orange and pink. A sense of purpose washed over her. Perhaps her path had always been leading here, to this fight, in this place she called home. Later that evening, as she walked outside, a sudden drizzle cooled the air. She raised her eyes to the gray sky. She thought of how just weeks ago she was an unknown attorney returning to Atlanta. Now she was at the center of a larger narrative about justice, equality, and the future of policing in America. Some called it luck, others called it destiny, but Nia believed it was simply the result of standing firm against injustice, holding on to her moral compass no matter how strong the winds of adversity blew. And yes, in the end, karma had found its mark. The first official meeting for the newly formed Task Force on Law Enforcement Accountability and Community Trust was held at a grand conference room in a federal building in downtown Atlanta. Nia stepped in wearing a sharp navy blue suit, her posture upright, her expression focused. She still couldn't quite believe she was here, seated alongside legal scholars, civil rights activists, community leaders, and high-ranking officials from the Department of Justice. The goal was ambitious: to draft recommendations for reducing police misconduct and rebuilding public trust, not just in Atlanta, but nationwide. Cameras lined the perimeter of the room, capturing the historic nature of the task force's creation. Journalists scribbled notes, trying to glean sound bites from the panel. A hush fell over the room when the task force chairperson, a respected federal judge named Margaret Liu, spoke into the microphone. "Welcome, everyone. We have been brought together at a pivotal moment in our nation's history. Our communities demand accountability, and our officers deserve clear guidelines and support. Let's work to bridge the gap." Nia glanced at the nameplate in front of her. Nia Parker, Director of Legal Advocacy, Atlanta Civil Rights Center. She thought back to her earlier self, the anxious law student at Harvard, the soldier learning to navigate legal matters on foreign soil, the newly minted attorney returning home to make a difference. Now, with the eyes of the country on her, she had a chance to enact real change. During the meeting, Nia contributed insights from her own harrowing experience. She detailed the flaws she saw firsthand: the lack of accountability mechanisms, insufficient training on racial bias, and minimal community engagement. Voices around the table echoed her concerns, some offering innovative solutions like adopting body cameras with strict privacy guidelines, creating independent review boards, and implementing robust de-escalation training. The conversation was intense but hopeful. By the end of the session, they had formed subcommittees to tackle specific issues. Nia was placed on the Policy and Training Subcommittee, a role she gladly embraced. She left the meeting buzzing with excitement, a binder full of notes clutched in her hands. Outside, she was immediately greeted by reporters. "Miss Parker, how does it feel to go from being a defendant to a voice for reform?" asked a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Nia offered a poised smile. "It's a privilege. My personal experience shouldn't have happened, but if it sparks reforms that prevent others from suffering the same, then it wasn't in vain." Another reporter asked, "Any word on Officer Marshall?" Cameras zeroed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on her face. She answered carefully, "I only know that he's no longer serving on the force. The department has to decide its next steps. I believe accountability means consequences for wrongdoing. I trust the system to do its job, now more than ever." In truth, she had heard rumors that Marshall faced possible charges related to falsifying documents. But she had no desire to dwell on that. Karma had already done its work, stripping him of the uniform he once hid behind. Later that day, she returned to the offices of the Atlanta Civil Rights Center to a round of applause from the staff. They had watched the live feed of the task force meeting and were bursting with pride. Melissa was among them, grinning ear to ear. "You were amazing, Nia," Melissa said, ushering her into a small conference room. "You've become a symbol of resilience. More clients are reaching out, donors want to contribute, and the center has never been in a better position." Nia's cheeks warmed under the praise. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still so much to do." Melissa nodded. "Agreed. Speaking of which, we have several new potential plaintiffs who claim they were wronged by Marshall. Are you up for taking lead on those cases?" A spark of determination lit Nia's eyes. "Absolutely." Days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into months. Nia juggled her responsibilities on the task force with her work at the center. She spent long nights drafting policy proposals, attending community town halls, and meeting with families who had lost loved ones to police violence. In each handshake and hug, she felt the weight of people's stories pressing on her heart, fueling her determination. Meanwhile, the internal affairs investigation and the potential criminal case against Marshall wove its way through the legal system. Former colleagues testified against him, as did a handful of victims emboldened by Nia's victory. Eventually, the district attorney charged him with multiple counts, including falsifying official documents and violating civil rights under color of law. The trial was set to begin in a few months. Though Nia had no official role in that prosecution, she monitored it closely. She understood that a guilty verdict could send a powerful message, that no one was above the law, especially not those sworn to uphold it. For the first time in years, she felt genuine optimism that change was possible. One late evening, she paused her work to stare out the window of her new office. The city lights twinkled, stretching toward the horizon. She wondered how many others were out there, quietly fighting their own battles against injustice. With a deep breath, she reminded herself that while she had come a long way, her journey was nowhere near over. A faint knock on her door made her turn. Melissa stood there, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. "I figured you could use a pick-me-up," she said warmly. Taking the mug, Nia inhaled the rich aroma. "Thanks," she replied, grateful for Melissa's unyielding support. "You know," Melissa said, "when this all started, I never guessed it would lead here. A city on the brink of reform, a newly influential civil rights center, and you, becoming a national figure." Nia let out a soft chuckle. "Neither did I, but I'm thankful. Not for being arrested, never for that, but for having the chance to make something good come out of it." They clinked coffee mugs in an unspoken toast, a pact between friends who had navigated the tempest together. As she sipped the hot liquid, Nia felt a profound sense of purpose settle within her. She thought of her parents, her father's civil rights stories, her mother's unwavering belief in her potential. She thought of the vows she made when she first put on the army uniform, and she thought of every person who looked to her now as a beacon of hope. Outside, the dawn of a new Atlanta was beginning to break, and inside Nia's heart, a new dawn had broken as well. What started as an unjust arrest had transformed into a powerful wave of reform, a testament that a single spark, lit by truth and courage, could ignite a flame of change. And so, with coffee in hand and unshakable resolve in her soul, Nia Parker stood ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to make justice ring from every courthouse and every corner of her beloved country. And there you have it. The incredible journey of Nia Parker, the unassuming black attorney who went toe-to-toe with a rogue cop and ultimately reshaped the conversation on policing and accountability. From her unexpected arrest to her triumphant court battle and subsequent rise as a key voice in national reform, Nia's story proves that courage, resilience, and a commitment to justice can move mountains, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Now we want to hear from you. If you found inspiration in Nia's resolve or learned something new about the complex struggle for civil rights, please help us spread the word. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate truth and transformation. Together, we can continue to shine a light on injustice and champion the changes our communities so urgently need.